The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
This episode is brought to you by Jane Austen. Okay, that's not actually true. This episode is brought to you by Writing with Jane Austen, a new 6-week online creative writing course taught by me, Jonathan Rogers. Starting April 6th, we will read through Pride and Prejudice together. Then we'll examine how Jane Austen works her particular kind of magic, and then we'll apply those principles to our own writing. You can find out more at thehabit.co/Jane. Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. The Wingfeather Tales started out life as a Kickstarter stretch goal. In the Kickstarter campaign to fund The Warden and the Wolf King, Book 4 of the Wingfeather Saga, Andrew Peterson recruited 5 writer friends to write stories set in Erear, the world of the Wingfeathers. He also recruited some of his favorite illustrators to illustrate the stories. That compilation, The Wingfeather Tales, has just been re-released by Waterbrook Press. I was able to sit down with most of the authors of the Wingfeather Tales for this episode of the Habit Podcast. Welcome to this very special episode of the Habit Podcast. We're talking about Wingfeather Tales, and this is the newly re-released collection of stories set in Andrew Peterson's Erear world, and we have 5 of the people who contributed stories to this. So Andrew, tell us about kind of what Wingfeather Tales is, how it came to be, all that.
Well, I remember we were kickstarting book 4 to try to, plus all the production value of book 4 and make it a hardback. Book 4 of the Wingfeather. Sorry, book 4 of the Wingfeather Saga. That was the conclusion of the thing, and the campaign went really well, and we met all our stretch goals, and then we were trying to think of new stretch goals, and I think Pete had the idea. Somebody had the idea to invite a bunch of Rabbit Room friends to contribute short stories set in the world of Erear. And I expected that it would be this little slim, 50, 75 page volume, and it ended up being longer than the first book. So it was you, Jonathan Rogers, Pete Peterson, Jennifer Trafton, Indy Wilson, and Doug McKelvey all contributed. And then the other part of the idea was to invite a bunch of illustrators, individual illustrators to illustrate each story. So it involved my son Aiden Peterson and Justin Gerard and Corey Godby and Nicholas Cole and Doug Tenaple. It was just amazing. This amazing A-team of some of my favorite writers and illustrators all throwing in ideas for this series, this compilation, whatever.
What was that like entrusting your fictional world to?
It was not hard for me. Really? I'm not being bashful when I say this. I have great doubts about my own abilities as a writer, and not doubts about you guys' abilities as a writer. So I was like, man, this will be like the best thing that ever happened to the world of Air is to have you guys all pitch in. And so, and I think that part of that is because I've kind of learned that from being a musician first, is that if I have an idea for a song, I know that if I turn that song over to Ben Shive and he brings his musicians in, and then most of the time I don't have to say a word and the song finds its legs and gets better and better and better. And so I enjoy that process of taking the little nugget of an idea and then inviting other people to add to it. And so it was, I wasn't super protective of it. And it was just really fun. Like I wrote in the intro that no one will experience reading Wingfeather Tales like I did. And the analogy that I used was like, imagine that I built a house, like I came up with the architectural plan and paid the builder and walked through it every day of the building of the house, and then had all you guys over for dinner on the first night, and then you guys showed me all these secret passageways. And so in my own house I was discovering things that I didn't know were there.
Oh, that's fun. Yeah. Because a lot of these stories sort of grow out of maybe footnotes that you would... Do all of them grow out of footnotes from your...
No, not footnotes so much. Like yours did, because I mentioned the Ballad of Lanrick and Rube in the first book. And I even kind of give the little plot synopsis. And
that's very helpful, by the way.
Yeah, you're welcome. And then that was based on a Kate Rusby song called William and Davy. Like, that's an old English song.
Really?
Some version of that happens, and I thought, oh, that'd be fun. Fun little steal.
I didn't even know that.
And then Jennifer's is all based on Pembroke, which tons of footnotes are Pembroke, but the rest of them I think were just like backstories of characters that showed up in that.
Yeah, I was thinking that you'd actually mention things that were then... Because Doug's story, didn't you mention something that Doug built?
Well, Sarah Cobbler is, and I just gave away a huge spoiler. Sorry. Whoops. No, I mentioned it in the story. She is a footnote, but she's also a main character. And so Doug expanded.
Yeah.
So my question is, was it hard for you guys? I would love to know from you guys what it was like to make... Was it freeing to be writing a story where you got to play in somebody else's sandbox, or was it stressful?
I would say it was very freeing to say, okay, I've got a plot, I've got some characters, and now I just sort of add my little, add a fist fight, and we're done.
That's good.
That's a good question. I think it was, for me, it was a little bit of both. It was freeing in one sense because, I don't know if you know this, but like I've always wanted to write a fantasy series, and now I feel like I never can. Because it'll just seem like, oh, that Pete guy is just trying to copy Andrew now. Because like, I mean, honestly, like if I was to write a fantasy series, it would be a lot the same in a lot of ways. So I feel like being able to write a short story was like, ooh, I can finally put this to work, you know, which was a lot of fun. But then it was terrifying because I immediately knew I wanted to write about Poto because he was a sailor and a pirate, and I know my way around that, and it sounds like fun. But having to like thread a needle of writing a backstory for a character that's so central to the book without betraying anything of that character was kind of nerve-wracking.
What do you mean when you say betraying? What do you mean?
Well, I didn't want to... I couldn't write anything that would feel like it was not true to Poto's character.
Yeah.
Or the character he would become. And that's just delicate. Yeah. Especially when it's not mine.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was interesting. And super fun.
I was terrified at first because of the pressure of living up to this commitment you created. But I remember you asked me to do it during a time when I was going through a severe writer's block. And I just had this huge internal struggle about it. But then once I discovered the Pembroke character and the way that I could do it, it was very freeing to have this huge bunch of raw material there for me that I didn't have to come up with. That I think that actually helped me through that period of writer's block because you gave me all this wonderful stuff to work with, and then I just had fun with it. It was one of the most fun experiences I've had with writing for a long time.
It is like the most Jennifer Trafton thing in the world. It is. There are so many words like I can't even think of any right now. Besweebling is coming.
Well, it was I discovered that piece of what you had done that was most like me.
Yeah.
So it was like the most like my own voice.
Yeah.
And so now it's really a bummer because I loved writing with that voice so much, and I can't do it anymore now because it's your character. I'm like, man, I can never go back to being Pembroke again.
Well, if the series takes off, then we'll do a special episode that you can write.
So this is interesting. So you just said that you found the piece of the Wingfeather saga that was most like your voice.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what happened to me.
Yeah.
Like I found the part that was about pirates and sailors.
Yeah.
And, Moby Dick and all that. And then you found something that was very Feechy-like.
That's true.
And then Doug, you found something that's the most Doug thing. Which is fascinating.
That is true. Yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I thought it was fun to start the story that I wrote within the confines of parts of Erwiar that you had mapped out already. But then my instinct was to send the character, beyond the maps, which is the title of the story, and have fun with, kind of describing what was in regions of this world that you hadn't explored yet, and there was a different kind of freedom in that, I think. Yeah.
Did you set out to write a Western?
Yeah, on some level, I wanted a story that had that kind of feel and some of those elements. I mean, the starting point for me was in the first few pages of book 1, where you just have this passing reference to an incident that happens and to parents whose daughter is taken. And for me, as a father of 3 daughters, I just was like, wait a second, you, Andrew, just did this to this guy, and then we don't hear from him again. So I had to know, well, what becomes of him? What is his story from that point? Where does a father go who's just lost his child in this kind of way, and what's his journey? And I didn't set out to write a long story, but it was just a natural result of that being the beginning point, and I didn't know what the ending point would be, and so I'm just following this character, and it turned out that it took a significant amount of real estate for his journey to come to any sort of resolution.
Yeah,
in a way that felt like that to me didn't feel contrived.
Yeah.
Any point at which I might have tried to end the story earlier and wrap it up, just it didn't feel like it honored the gravity of the loss and the journey that would be required.
Yeah.
One question I've always had for you, Doug, is like, did you know ahead of time that we'd be splitting up royalties according to page count? Because I didn't.
I'm bitter about it.
Oh man.
No, I did not know that at the time. I was just
I could have written a long one too.
I was chasing the story.
One of the things I love about the Wingfeather books is that you give the impression that there's always more than you're telling, and that's a big part of what the footnotes do. Is there's this world that we're getting a glimpse of it, but we're only getting a glimpse. I mean, we're getting a major. I mean, it's an important glimpse, but there's lots of. It just feels like a full world, and that's one of the things I love. In your story, Doug, that you're going off and. Based on that thing you saw in the first couple of pages of the first book, here's a little corner that can be explored. That's one of the things I love about the whole series. But then it opens up the possibility of these kind of stories with very different tones, right? Very different subject matter, and I'd be interested to know there's no good way to know this in a podcast format, but to readers, does this feel like we're still in the Wingfeather?
I have heard great things from readers. One of my, the release was so recent that we haven't heard, like the new release. I can't wait to hear what comments are. But yeah, the feedback in the first release several years ago was awesome. And I think that one of the things that I love about it is that the thing that happens in fantasy that really makes it matter to me is when you've got all this whimsy and all the craziness of the world, but the characters that are living in that world feel like actual characters. Like the things that they're encountering are like, you get to explore what an actual person how they would deal with the toothy cow in the woods. You know what I mean? So this weird like mashup of this completely other world with this very familiar humanity thrown into it is part of the fascinating thing to it. So to me, like the groundedness of it all is part of the fun, and the groundedness of it is kind of where these things come from. It's like like seeing Poto as a young man. I feel like I know Poto so well because his character was like very real to me, and now I'm getting this looking at the photo album of what happened to him. But it's like easy for me as the author to say, oh yeah, and kids would get taken by the black carriage, and for you to then go, what does that actually look like? How would an actual human being deal with his daughter being taken? Is more or less what these stories are about.
That fantasy question, what would happen if the rest of that sentence should be, knowing what we know about the way human beings work, what would happen if, right? If they were a toothy cow, knowing what we know about the way people's options as human beings, how would they deal with the toothy cow?
People's options in the context of cows.
And Jennifer,
what are our options here?
I love the fact that Jennifer's. I think your idea for the story happened because of a typo or an inconsistency in my timeline. Do you remember this?
I don't remember.
I had I remember in the first book I was just coming up with arbitrary dates for things, So third epic year 353, and it would be 3/353, and like the book publishes the dates that the books were published were just kind of like picked out of a hat. But Pembroke's Creaturepedia, I had the publication date didn't work with the timeline of the rest of my story, and so your story starts with it's framed as a letter from him to the publisher, complaining about the fact that there was a typo. So once again, like you take the material and you go, what would actually happen? What could explain this?
Yeah. That's fun.
Yeah,
that's great.
Now, the editorial process, I was under the impression, because on the front it says editor Andrew Peterson, that you had edited the book.
Yeah.
Turns out it's Pete.
Well, I curated the book.
I think there were two levels of editing. You made sure everything was right in the world, and then I was just doing the technical editing.
We were talking earlier about your story, Pete. Andrew made you tone it down some. I want to hear about that again.
Well, if there's anything that's true about me as a writer, then it's that I always overwrite everything and then have to scale my stuff back to where it's palatable. And this was no exception. The story's about Poto as a young man who's a pirate and how they're hunting the young sea dragons. And so, there's a moment late in the book when the ship is being attacked by a sea dragon, and I was really getting into it and then writing, the movie that's in my mind, which is always too violent for kids. Now, I remember specifically there was a moment where the sea dragon kind of has eaten a few sailors over the course of the story, and then it comes up on the ship, and Poto's kind of facing it off, and the sea dragon, screams at him, and as the sea dragon is roaring, Poto can see into its gullet that there's a sailor that's half eaten, impaled on a tooth, like a molar. It's just kind of reaching out to be saved. And, as the dragon is withdrawing, it's just this hopelessly bleak image.
Doug is currently writing his backstory.
And like in my mind, I was like, this is me firing on all cylinders. This is so awesome. And anyway, I gave it to Andrew, and Andrew was like, man, this is a little much. And I was like, really? But it's the best part. And so anyway, as you often do as a writer, you get mad at your editor, and then you go sleep on it, and you realize he was right. So I had to rewrite that whole scene, or didn't have to rewrite the whole scene, but I had to take the sailor out of the dragon's mouth. But then I had to find a way to make that moment as meaningful in a different way. And that forced me to like reckon with, really what's going on in this moment? Why is this happening? And, that resulted in a much better scene that ends up being one of my favorite moments in the story that had ripple effects throughout the rest of the story, actually, in the way that things came together in, just minor ways. But like, I was just so grateful for that kind of feedback, because my favorite part of the creative process is those parts where somebody else comes into the process and creates tension that you have to resolve, and it's almost the synthesis is always better than what you could have done alone. And I think that's the Holy Spirit,
which I think is kind of a picture of what this whole book was like.
Yeah, I mean, as a writer, you have an option when an editor gives you advice and says, we don't need the half-eaten sailor. The easy step is just to take out the half-eaten sailor, or you can say, this is an opportunity to rethink this whole thing, what you just described, and even if that's fixing a sentence, taking an opportunity to really rethink the way things are, things are going.
I was going to say the readers have no idea what they're in for with the Places Beyond the Maps with Doug's story, because it's written in this Cormac McCarthy voice, and if you guys haven't read Cormac McCarthy, you should, maybe.
Give it to your children.
Careful. But The Road is an incredible book, but I've read a few of his westerns, and as soon as I started your book, I was like, oh my goodness, he's channeling Cormac McCarthy. So it was like a combo of one of my favorite writers, you, channeling one of my favorite writers, Cormac McCarthy, in a western, which is one of my favorite genres, but in a fantasy novel. It was crazy. But you have these, like, one of the things that Cormac McCarthy, and I guess Faulkner does too, I've never read Faulkner, but these long, paragraph-long sentences, And when the book was sent over to the Random House editors, the people who were going to kind of like giving it a once-over before, they came back to me with like, this is going to take a long time because we need to break up all of these paragraphs into sentences, because I don't know if you're aware that it was like, well, of course I'm aware. And I kind of put the kibosh on it and just said, you can't change a single sentence of Doug's story. Like, you have to leave it alone. Like, everything there is as it's meant to be. And then had the pleasure of reading the audiobook for it a few weeks ago, and every one of the stories was so fun to read. Pete's was all told first person from the point of view of a pirate, which meant that I had to sustain a pirate accent for 45 minutes or whatever it was. But man, there were a few sentences in your story that I just burst into tears. I was in the studio just like I was kind of a mess because they were so I want to say majestic, magnificent. I don't know. These huge, sentences that like I had to read like 4 times to understand what it was that you were trying to say. And then when I realized what you were trying to say, I was just like, holy cow, it's like 2 pages long, this sentence, Anyway, it's really, really something. And one of my favorite Amazon reviews, I don't know if you guys remember this, but somebody left a review on Amazon that was like each story. Yes. And it was like each story was reviewed in reference to Doug's story. It was like, Jonathan's poem is really wonderful, but it cannot hold a candle to Doug's. Andrew's story is neat and an enjoyable ride, but it cannot come close to the majesty that is Doug McKelvey's. It was an amazing review. Anyway, but like the combination of all of them, like I feel like there's like a little bit in there for everybody. And I'm excited for these kids to discover you guys as writers.
Great. I think we're done here. Thanks everybody for being here. This is really fun.
Yeah.
This podcast is brought to you by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. And all our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com. And to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate. Special thanks as well to Taylor Linhart for letting us use her song Diamonds as the theme music for Season 3 of the Habit podcast. You can learn more about Taylor and follow her work at taylorlinhart.com.
The Habit membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.